I think many organizations don't give enough credit and space to citizen developers. And so I would say the fault I find with many organizations is the citizen developer support group is because somebody in some citizen developers decided to create it themselves. And that's good in that they are motivated to do stuff. And it's bad in that then they're not going to have the rest of the information you need from an organizational perspective to understand what your guardrails are. And I have a DBA background. I know SQL Server. I know Oracle. I know Sybase. Dataverse is its own beast, right? So it's gaining problems, but gaining capability at the same time. And so I think at that point, that's why the organization needs to really, if you're going to give your staff that access, you really need to think it through.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to C-Space Black Space. Today, I am here with Jeremy Wood, and of course, I'm your host, Amy Cisse. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today. We have known each other for a very, very long time.
Yep.
And I've always had great conversations with you. So as the federal IT influencer, please give an intro of who you are.
Yeah, as you said, Amy, my name is Jeremy Wood. I work for the federal government. I'm at my 5th federal agency now, so I've had a lot of experience in IT in a lot of aspects. I've done a lot of different jobs in IT, but my primary background is as a software engineer, so I kind of take everything from an architecture design perspective. And I'm also a podcaster. I have the podcast, The Geek Within, and we'll put some links out there, and always happy to engage people in the community.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. Geeks Within. So you showcase lots of different people as well with their expertise. And it's of course, as a geek, it means they're in the tech space, right? But then you might have people on that maybe not be technical, but they still touch tech. Is that how that works?
Yeah, it started out as geeks, just tech geeks, but it's turned into just geeks in general, because I've learned there are people who geek about real estate. There are people who geek about other topics that I am not an expert on, and then I get very excited when I hear them geek out about it.
Nice. So speaking of getting excited about geeking out about different things that people are working on. So as it relates to citizen development, how are you helping people in the organization with that path?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about what I call the citizen developer maturity path, or I hate to call it a model because that sounds too official and it might mean I thought it through all the way, but certainly a path. And this has come about in the last multiple years as Microsoft has really produced these tools that let us do citizen development. And the funny thing is, I look way back in my career and I realize there's always been some level of citizen development, because you could always do Microsoft Access, you could do Microsoft Excel, you could do, back when VBA wasn't a scary thing, you could do macros, and you could always design things inside products to try to make your job easier. And so in the cloud world, Microsoft's doing that through other technologies, right? So there's the SharePoint list. In M365, the SharePoint list has gotten very cool, right? It's got templates you can use. It's got abilities to color the values in there. Calculated columns have been there for quite some time, but you're able to store data, use it to collect data, use it to get people to track things. So a SharePoint list vanilla is so very powerful because it's an area that multiple people can go to and leverage, right? So that's probably where more people, but most people get introduced in M365 at the citizen level. They wanted to get out of their Excel spreadsheet and move it into something they think is more enterprisey, if you will, more available, and looks a little prettier than an Excel spreadsheet. So in my experience, at least, that's kind of like the first thing people start to tackle. And then once you have a SharePoint list, the next step in your path is to go, okay, now what can I do with this, right? How do I build workflow? Workflow is a key business process thing, right? A challenge that we have in our organizations. Classically, it might be email so-and-so this information, and they do something, and then they email it to somebody else, and then they email it to them, right? But in Microsoft 365 with Power Automate, we can create simple approval workflows or complicated multi-stage workflows that allow you to get a lot of people involved in a business process. And Power Automate's got tons of great utility even at the basic levels. You can just send notifications or alerts based on changes that are happening in M365. You can, like I said, you can do approvals, you can do feedbacks. So let's say you're using it as kind of your SharePoint list is kind of a sort of ticketing system, if you will, or tracking some sort of work. And at the end of a completion, you can have Power Automate automatically send them an email and ask them their opinion on how well you completed their stuff, right? Power Automate can do data import and data export. So it really starts to open the world to real what developers would have done for you previously, like a DBA or a hard code, developer. Now you as a citizen developer have this ability to interact with all of these systems behind the scenes, depending on your licensing, right? That's always that caveat, depending on your licensing. But even just out of the box, Power Automate is extremely powerful for managing your own workflows. And I think many businesses, that's their first stage. I don't know what I want to include you in this conversation because I know you do these things. Is that what you kind of see?
Absolutely. So I do agree with usually the transition or the pain point, I should say, is that there's an Excel spreadsheet and people like to download the spreadsheet from SharePoint. It disconnects it from SharePoint now and they email it around. And now there's all these multiple copies floating around. And then they realize, wait, that there's a mismatch in the data now. And so they start saying, how can we centralize this? How can we store it in one place so that people are not sending this file back and forth through email? And to your point, right? So it's like taking it out of that whole, it's buried in a file versus, all right, let's open it up. And now we can do cool things like filtering and sorting through that data and taking it to the next level. Maybe they're trying to customize the way it looks, right? Because that's the other part is, maybe we don't need everyone touching all the fields in this form that comes with the SharePoint list. So then they start talking about, how can we customize this? And then it leads into Power Automate. And so PowerApps, right? So my question for you is, where do you see people getting stuck? Like the things that they do with all these apps where they get tripped up?
Yeah, first I want to acknowledge that what you stated was my exact step on the next step in I see in a path, which is I have all this data. Now I want to keep people from accessing or editing certain parts of the data. And that's not native to a SharePoint list. You can't do any sort of column level security. I'm sure you can create views and you can do some level of lockdown, but it's extremely limited. That's when you start to mess around with PowerApps and you unlock that editing form. You create that custom form capability and then you tie it to their account, create some sort of role-based system, right? Where you say based on whoever's doing what, they only see these fields, especially during like a multi-approval process, right? Maybe you don't want somebody to be able to edit what was submitted prior in the approval work chain. So anyway, I just love that you had immediately, we're on the same wavelength and that's what you said. I would tell you in terms of pain points, I think what people don't realize is when you start talking workflow, you're talking setting something in the data, some field or multiple fields with values to help you track where you are so you don't lose yourself in this workflow. And I see a lot of people don't think that through before they start, right? Now, I don't like to print things. I'm not a guy who prints stuff anymore. I'm a non-paper person. But when it comes to planning a workflow, you've got to sketch it somewhere. It doesn't matter if you do it in OneNote, you do it on a electronic whiteboard or a real whiteboard or paper. You've got to really draw a classic flow chart, if you will, to figure out, okay, what are all my states? Who all is involved? How am I going to control this? What's this workflow process look like, right? And in the classic developer environment, that's your kind of requirements document, if you will, the minimum requirements document. And so I think citizen developers need to consider minimal documentation that helps them be successful as they do it. And that's because there are limitations. Like I recently ran into a limitation with Power Automate, and I have the premium license for Power Automate where I'm at. I didn't realize you could only go 9 levels deep in conditions. I'm like, uh-oh, I got to rethink my workflow because my workflow had 4. Now, that's not to say there aren't complicated methods to overcome that, right? But for a citizen developer, they won't know about child workflows or child flows, right? That's not something they immediately know about. So these are things you can think through at the beginning. So for me, the first pain point they're going to run into is, how do I make sure it goes to the right person at the right time and they only see what they're supposed to see? That would worry me in a business process. Every time that worries me.
I think that when you are trying to get people to even change their behavior and use this new fancy SharePoint workflow thing, you have to get buy-in that the process that you have drafted up is actually the real process and that they're really going to participate in your process before you go and build it. Because I've seen that too, right? Where someone thinks, oh, this is the process. And it's like, nope, that's not it actually. Or, well, wait, we don't even really know what the full process is just yet. So before you go build, design first.
I think what they will learn quickly, citizen developers will learn quickly why IT always asks for that.
Build it so that people can actually use it, right?
Right. They're like, why are you making us sit here through like 6 requirement sessions and interviewing us for all of our different processes? Why can't you just build me my tool? Well, now a citizen developer learns very quickly. It's because not everybody really knows what their business process is. You're actually helping document a process that's probably never been written down.
Exactly. That happens all the time, right? It's like, right. So even if you have this process written out and you finally got it figured out, right? Like they have finally given you all the information about the process. If you have other people that have to participate to do approvals, for example, it's a requirement, then I think having backup people also that can stand in and also be the approver is helpful as well, so that your process doesn't fall apart if they happen to be out of the office for an entire month. Because then there are just delays in pushing your process forward, or people abandon using this tool or app or process that you've created. And it was all a waste of your time.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one pain point, right? Is understanding the process, understanding the flow and everybody involved and who it goes to next. I think from a technology perspective, the first pain point is when they try to use Power Automate and they're trying to do something complicated, and there is no help in Power Automate. There's nothing that tells you how do I do, well, there's nothing that tells you in the government cloud.
I was about to say, well, yeah. So, right. Because there's the new designer. You do start to see traces of that in government, but then in commercial, you see the Copilot Studio part that kind of tries to help you, but you still have to know your end goal, and you still have to understand the concept of using variables.
That's right. Variables is the big one.
Yes. Conditions, the case statements, the switch statements, like you have to understand those concepts before you get in there, because you're going to get stuck.
Yeah. Let's say you're doing a simple workflow that is watching items sitting in a list and says, 30 days before it's due, I send an alert to somebody. You've got to be able to figure out, oh my gosh, how do I calculate that today is 30 days before that due date, right? These are simple things in your head, but complicated to implement. And so, Google or Bing or whatever your preferred search engine becomes your best friend when you're trying to figure these things out.
Right. So are you helping people from a let me help you push forward with these implementations perspective? Are you giving them training? Is it one-on-one support? Like, what does that look like?
So I've only been at 2 organizations that have had this technology in my career, because it's still that young, if you will, even though I feel like it's been around forever, it's still that young in terms of its usage. And I would say both those organizations had similar challenges when people wanted to be citizen developers. I mean, the great idea behind citizen developer is IT gets out of the way of the business, in theory, right? And I think that's fantastic. But then to be able to enable them to do that, I think what you're saying is how do they get help? What support does the organization provide? So I would say at a bare minimum, this is just based on my own experience. If you want to call it fancy, you could say you need to set up a center of excellence, or I think I've even heard it called a center of enablement, which I think they actually have different purposes, and they could be both need to be set up. But ultimately, you're really trying to set up a place where people can go and say, how do I begin to learn about what my organization is going to allow me to do? That's the first question, right?
Mm-hmm.
What has my organization done in their governance policy? And how does that translate to practically, how does it impact me both positively and negatively in terms of the tools I'm trying to take advantage of? Great example would be if your organization doesn't let you have Power Automate at all, unless you go through some request process and prove business purpose for it. Right. And many government organizations lean that direction. Not all of them, but some of them do. So I think it's important for organizations to provide a site where not only you could provide links to, say, education that's out there. There's tons and tons of free education out there. Microsoft's got content. There are some great YouTubers out there. My all-time favorite is April Dunham, good friend. She produces amazing content. You're fantastic at this stuff, so I call you if I run into problems, right? So you start to build a network of people, right, that you can reach out to. But within your organization, you want to try to build a network of people within your organization. Simply start with creating a team and call it something like Power Platform Citizen Developers or something crazy, right? And find out who's starting to tinker and experiment and say, hey, come join my team. And in this team, we can support one another. And then slowly over time, you can use the SharePoint site behind that team to publish things like what's the governance for the organization? What are restrictions? What is the organization doing to allow you to share your experiences? Like if I want to share a flow and package it and present it, maybe they have a little like a document library or a SharePoint list where you can share your code basically and put it out there so others can use it. You provide an explanation of what it does. What about monthly meetings where somebody comes and demos something that they've done? That has worked out very successfully at many organizations. It gives you a chance to brag at what you figured out and gives somebody else to go, oh, I want to know how to do that too. So, and you can decide if that's technical. You can decide if that's just showing off a process for idea's sake, right? I think many organizations don't give enough credit and space to citizen developers. And so I would say the fault I find with many organizations is the citizen developer support group is because somebody in some citizen developers decided to create it themselves. And that's good in that they are motivated to do stuff. And it's bad in that then they're not going to have the rest of the information you need from an organizational perspective to understand what your guardrails are.
Right. So speaking of guardrails, and you mentioned the word share, right? What do you think some of the risks with citizen developers are as it relates to how they're working with all these apps that they could share externally, or they could collect information externally? What are some of the guardrails that should be put in place or just thought about or planned for at a high level?
Some of them are just going to be straight up policy. Unfortunately for us, Microsoft's tools don't have the ability to restrict it in every sort of way. So for instance, I think you and I just had this conversation the other day, Microsoft Forms, if you enable it to allow people to send those surveys externally to the organization, you can't say who is allowed. It's a blanket for the entire organization or a blanket not for the entire organization. And that's very frustrating, right, from a governance perspective, because especially in a government entity, not everybody has the ability, not everybody has the right or ability or should have the ability to send citizens, meaning the general public, some sort of query. There are all kinds of rules about collecting information from the public, about where does that data go, the statements that have to be on that form, and all kinds of, there's just tons and tons of rules. And where does that data go once it's collected? It's going to be FOIAble because it's public data. And so
questions being asked too.
Correct. If it's going to contain PII, right? If you're asking them personal information about themselves or their business or their, yeah. And so it gets very scary. I mean, most organizations I've been at have that turned off because of that feature, and they rolled out some other tool that let them control who had access to it. And that's a shame, right? Because those tools are so powerful and so great. But as a government entity, there are different rules. Now, maybe that's not as big an issue for a private institution, although I would think brand, maintaining your brand and ensuring there isn't some sort of data leak would be important from their perspective as well. So I think those are challenges. Where we're able to control it, I think we should. And where we're not able to control it, I think we should just set policy and educate people. So for instance, in this case, if you wanted to be able to use those forms, maybe the public affairs office has a legitimate need, or maybe some program office that has a mission that's involved the public has a specific need. I think they should do it. And then policy should say nobody else does it. And then IT department gets to be the bad guy and says, hey, wait a second, you weren't supposed to create that, and send it outside their agency, right? And, do some sort of compliance audit function. Unfortunately, that becomes a bad guy, the stick, right? So
yeah,
that's a challenging problem.
It is. It's very reactive.
Yeah.
It's very, I mean, you can put the policies out there. You can hope that they read the policies, and it would be great. And I have seen a lot of information for several years now, people asking for forms admin centers. And so otherwise, it's very reactive in the sense of you have to look at auto logs to see, well, who created it and is it shared externally? So ideally it would be in the sense of like SharePoint, right? Where you can at least have some sort of controls in there that says, okay, this site can be shared externally, or this form can be shared externally would be nice, but that's just not the case.
Yeah, we're getting closer. I mean, Power Pages could solve this problem. You could create a Power App that's a Power Page, right? There's a cost to that, but you could control your risk that way by spending money, right? That's the way we always control risk in the government. We spend money to control risk. So there are ways to do it that are more complicated, but could be done. I like your idea of a SharePoint list. They have that new forms feature in SharePoint lists.
I was literally just I'm like, wait a minute, maybe we could try to do some sort of guidance there that says use the SharePoint list, create a form there, and it hides everything behind the scenes, and it still acts like a form, but at least it's connected to the site, and there's more ownership, and it's identifiable of who is doing what and where the data is actually getting stored.
Yeah, and I'd have to go look at the admin center and see, can you limit which forms are allowed to be seen externally or not? That would be something I have to go investigate.
So from a regular just MS Forms perspective, that's not the case. But as it relates to forms, the button
on the SharePoint list,
I would imagine that it respects the site settings for sharing.
We think so.
We think so. I said I imagine, right?
We would test that.
Right.
Test that hypothesis.
Right. Wait a minute, this is yeah.
And I think the other thing we have to keep in mind when we start talking citizen developers is, what do they do when they run into problems? How is if your organization is empowering them because you gave them a license to Power Automate, even if it's the one that's basic, and you gave them a license to have a SharePoint team, either your organization has a method for creating them, or they're able to create them themselves. And so they have these two powerful tools, even if you don't give them PowerApps, but they have these two powerful tools.
Right.
what happens when they try to do something they can't figure out. And sure, hopefully the first place they go is the citizen developer team you've created, if you've created that, which is why it's important to create it. And they can ask each other, I'm trying to do the XYZ and I can't figure out. But sometimes they may need to talk to somebody in IT who hopefully is knowledgeable enough, right? Because I would say, in my experience with Power Platform, is there's these opportunities for citizen developers, which I love supporting and I love interacting with, and I love talking about what they're doing. But I think there is a role for centralized IT to build solutions on Power Platform in a broader project-like sense, because it's meeting some larger mission objective. It's got funding associated with it, right? It's not somebody sitting at their desk using their spare time to build. And so there will be somebody hopefully more knowledgeable. Now, their level of availability could vary, but at my current agency, I can submit a ticket to the Power Platform team. I go into our ticketing system and I say, hey, guess what? I ran into this really interesting problem. At my agency, I have access to the Dataverse. I created a Dataverse table, and for some reason, my user can't access the table. They're getting an error. Once you start going to the Dataverse, things get crazy. And so it all comes down to security roles, right? In the Dataverse admin, there's security roles that have to be created, and then you have to map those security roles to what tables they're allowed to see, and then what can they do with that table? Is it read only, or they're able to more interact with it? And so it gets more complicated. And I was able to leverage my central IT because I had never used the Dataverse. My last work environment didn't have it. And I was like, oh, okay. They were able to show me one time how to do that so that I could do it for myself from then on. And also I can be a resource to others that I know that are citizen developers and say, hey, I had that problem. I know exactly the answer to that challenge, right? Or we have a SharePoint site where everybody can edit it, the page, and post like an FAQ style thing. I had an error trying to access my data in the Dataverse. And then those of us, we can, I added my answer to, here's how I solved it, right? I typed up an answer and then I put my name associated with it. So they knew to contact me if they needed more clarity based on that. And it's almost like a wiki page. Anybody can edit it. Anybody can add these new tips and tricks and problems. And then everybody can go there to look for solutions.
Nice. Very, very cool. I like that a lot. And when you mentioned Dataverse, it just made me think about like the Dataverse environment that gets created for the Dataverse for Teams environment that gets created when people create, or I should say connect a Power App or Power Automate inside of Teams, which I think is, in my opinion, like a nice, easy way for people to kind of get started with building solutions for their team if they don't necessarily have, a SharePoint site that they want to connect the data to, but they want to just build something quickly, or they don't have a Dataverse environment, right? But then the challenge becomes there's all these Dataverse for team environments sitting there, and if you have the ability to get to the Power Platform Admin Center, these apps are just kind of sitting in there and they're just, a year or two old. And then you have to then come up with some sort of way to help people understand, like, do you need it? Or did you create it by mistake because they were just playing around? So that from a maintenance perspective, the technical teams have to be considerate of, because of course, in the government space, you can't just have the data that's just deleted. If there's actually records stored in there, you have to actually take care of that data.
Yeah, this brings me back to that citizen developer maturity path, if you will. So, right before Dataverse is PowerApps, and PowerApps using like a SharePoint list as a data, right? Because you've been using a SharePoint list, maybe with a customized form, maybe not. You've been using Power Automate against that list. And now you want to graduate because you realized, oh, I created this customized list form and that was pretty cool, but it only let me create a form, in this certain format, right? Because it's that sidebar that pops out. I want to create something prettier, more verbose, a little more functionality. And then you take your first plunge into PowerApps and realize, oh my gosh, I got to build everything from scratch, right? I mean, they got some templates, but unless you really understand what those templates are, they're not going to be helpful. You're going to be starting with a blank slate. And that's when you start then you're your new problem comes in. How do I make it look good? Right?
Mm-hmm.
What are the best practices for colorization, for fonts, for layout on the screen, for accessing the data? And so, I mean, I think that is like, and then, as you said, with Dataverse, we go one more step further. So my organization has the access to the premium Dataverse. I am taking advantage of it for the first time ever because I never worked someplace that had that, right? I had only the free version that's built into Teams. And now I'm realizing, oh my gosh, now I have more problems that I didn't ever know how to solve before. And I have a DBA background. I know SQL Server, I know Oracle, I know Sybase. Dataverse is its own beast, right? So it's gaining problems, but gaining capability at the same time. And so I think at that point, that's why the organization needs to really, if you're going to give your staff that access, you really need to think it through, because there are big needs to think about. Like I said, you're going to have to start to become more familiar with how do you build a user experience. You need to, once you start doing PowerApps, the Power App itself, not a customized form, now you can connect to multiple data sources. So then you could use multiple lists as data sources at the same time. But you need to understand permissions are different in Power Apps than they are in Power Automate. In Power Automate, everything functions under the account that created the flow. Everything in Power Apps functions under the user who's using the form at the moment they use it. And so there's concepts have to be educated somehow. And that's why I am a big advocate of some sort of center of excellence, even if you don't call it that, some sort of portal to start educating people on. These are the capabilities. This is what our organization is giving you. And here's where you go to get help. First, as a citizen developer amongst yourselves. And then if you need to, here's the IT people who can help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would say that I know enough to be dangerous as it relates to Power Apps and Dataverse, but I have not gone down that road, but I know how to support the developers on the team. I think it's very arduous in terms of the controls and the labels, as you mentioned, and the positioning. And so
there are a lot of great YouTubers out there who have created content on the best way to design your Power Apps, some standard things to do. So I'm not going to re-implement all of them or re-talk about them all here. But I will say, once you go down that road, you start unlocking some serious capability, right? It's a real app building tool, things that I would have custom built as a C# developer, and it would have taken me, not too long, because they do have a lot of drag and drop in C# and the web builder and stuff. But certainly I would have had to plan out things at a much larger scale than you have to plan out here, especially if you're going to use SharePoint, a SharePoint list as your backend database, right? That's simple. Especially if you're not going to use more than one SharePoint list. So all your data is in one table. Wow, your app gets super simple. So I mean, things people can think about. And as a government entity, working for a government organization, these are things I think about. My team has built processes for cyclic review. So as a government entity, we have to review things like our policy on a 2 or 3 year basis, or procedures, or documents that we publish that are periodic rather than on a constant basis. And so we created a cyclic review process where you can go in and add these items into a list that says, these are the items and here's their cyclic review timeframe. And then it automatically creates planner tasks, assigns them to people. As you close the task, it updates the list and sets the next review date. And it does it all automatically using Power Automate and SharePoint List. It's really simple, really powerful though. Or submission forms. My office collects data from a variety of people for architecture purposes. And so we use SharePoint or we use Power Apps because we wanted to use some of the advanced features of creating pick lists from other data sources, like from a SQL data source or from a data source that's already been imported into Power BI. And so it gave us some more power to do so rather than having to recreate all that data in, say, a SharePoint list someplace. So I think Power Apps has the potential to change the way you do business. If you've been around the block like I have, and you ever created a system at Microsoft Access with multiple screens and reports, all of that's possible in the Power Platform. Power BI does your reporting engine. Power Apps is your Microsoft Access replacement, but it's in the cloud, and it just opens up all the capabilities.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah, I was a Microsoft Access developer for many, many, many years. And I think it's very similar in experience as well when you interact with it. Other than some of the web clunkiness, it's a very similar experience.
Nice. So, what are your thoughts on how Copilot is going to impact the federal government?
That's a loaded question of sorts. I participate in a lot of working groups, AI working groups. We have these conversations all the time around the latest and greatest, feature that comes out in the AI or machine learning field. And Gen AI is the big next thing. Of course, Microsoft is quickly putting that product into everything they can possibly put it into. Right? There's a Copilot for everything, and I believe there is even a Copilot to help you create Copilots for yourself. So how that impacts government, I think it's going to be a while before they are fully leveraged. I think there's going to be a trust issue. Government is always concerned about the sensitivity of the data we collect. And depending on your agency, depending on your mission, you have the trust of the public with the content, the information you have in your agency's data. And so we have to be very careful in that. We're always careful to make sure it's not just accidentally sharing outside our agency, but also within the agency, that certain areas are restricted to only that content, right? So, if you have an investigative section in your agency, they are not going to want their data being intermixed with somebody else's. So, with Gen AI models, those are really challenging, right? I think the future is bright, though, if we can get to the point where we can train like mini models. I know they're called large language models, but take a large language model and then purpose-driven it around a given mission set. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think the challenge will be for every federal agency, do we have enough information to train it in that, enough quality data to train it in that mission set? Or do we need to start thinking about cooperative interagency LLMs, where we have many government agencies have very similar functions? Can we leverage that to, like, every agency's got an HR function. Right. Can we leverage it to create, say, a government-wide HR LLM? Maybe. Right? Maybe. Okay. And then it's distributed to all the agencies for their use, or maybe it's centrally located for all their use. Something to think about.
Yeah.
For specific missions, like many years ago, I worked at USDA in the food safety mission, where they have lots of important information. I think the trick will be, how do we train it? How do we train it with limited data, and how do we give it quality data? I think that the sky is open to what it can do, just like it is for the public. Right. There are developers in government. Maybe it can be used to help them develop their code. Right. There are people who write lots and lots of documents, policy, procedural documents. Right. How is this going to change the landscape for how we write those documents? And today we do a lot of collaborative writing. Now maybe we won't. Maybe we'll have more collaborative reviewing. Right. I mean, I think that the promise of Gen AI is to take some of the mundane, lower level work out of off your plate, so that you can then more intently focus on the things that require a human brain to analyze, right? And there are many missions that require that, and we can free people up to do that.
Right. That's true. Think of all the policy documents that a government agency has, and just that update process could be a lot faster from that perspective. I like that a lot.
Well, we have lots of conversations. As a government entity, we have lots of internal conversations everywhere I've been around. What's the right statement in this policy, right? Or who's going to write this policy? Who gets to be the stucky this year to update this policy and update its procedures? I too would love to go to a Gen AI tool like Copilot and say, here's what I would like to have a procedure that talks about, and then have it produce it for me, right? And then all I'm doing is doing some cleanup, maybe some wordsmithing. Why not?
Yeah, I like that. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me today. You always have great perspectives. How can the audience get in contact with you?
Yeah, hit me up on LinkedIn. My handle is @GeekWithin. And same thing for YouTube. My handle is @GeekWithin if you're interested in my podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today.
All right, take care.